Hello and welcome back. Sean here, Mountains Garage. Today's subject is dump valves, transmission dump valves, torque converter dump valves. All ways of saying the same thing. And like all things in life, there's extremely simple ways to accomplish this with less result. And the more effort you put in, or the more difficult it becomes, the more result you get. So, not surprising, that's the way it goes. My goal in this video was to show the assembly of an extremely simple setup, about as simple as it gets. But in order to explain why it's simple, you have to explain how it can be more difficult. So let's get right into the parts and theory behind it. There is a dedicated port off of the pressure regulator valve in the transmission pump for converter charge pressure. It fills the torque converter. When you increase the pressure regulator, either replace a spring or shim it to increase the pressure from the pressure regulator, increasing the pressure in the entire transmission, you're also filling the torque converter faster to the point where you can cause it to move ahead, to shove on the back of the engine. We restrict that. If you watched my builds, we essentially cut the hole in half, and with the increased pressure spring in the pump, which you've done to run the trans brake and make it shift firmer and clamp the clutches tighter, good reasons to have increased pressure in your transmission. The side effect is it wants to push on the back of the crankshaft. The torque converter charge oil flows around the input shaft, which would be in the center of this torque converter hub that I cut off. It's a tool now, but imagine the oil flowing out of the transmission around the input shaft to fill the torque converter. And when it returns from the torque converter, it has to go down the input shaft. There's a hole drilled in it. Or if you have a solid input shaft and you've removed the front stator bushing, it goes around the input shaft to get back inside, out to the cooler, and back in from the cooler to lube the transmission. If you interrupt the torque converter charge oil before it gets to the torque converter, that would be the most expensive and difficult and most effective way to do it. You temporarily starve the torque converter feed. The torque converter has less oil in it now. It has what it had, but it stops being fed oil for a brief moment in time. No damage is done. But that's going to give you the most RPM gain. The torque converter is going to think it's looser than it is. It's going to act like it's looser. And of course, it's really effective at controlling the thrust. Many of your higher end dump valve kits also contain a regulator. It's more like a mechanical fuel injection pill, spring-loaded replaceable jet, and you would tap in a sending unit to go to a gauge inside, or maybe a Holly dash, and it will report the converter charge pressure at all times, and you can adjust it 50 to 70 pounds, whatever you think the magic number is, to get the effect you want. Many of your high-end dump valve kits also have a replaceable jet in the dump itself to allow you to control how many RPMs you're going to gain. Another tuning tool. If you wait until after the torque converter and the fluid comes down the input shaft, out through the case on the lower fitting, and you interrupt it with some simple plumbing and a 12-volt solenoid valve returning the oil back to the sump instead of going out to the cooler and back and then the lube circuit, you will have a smaller gain in RPM, but still a gain, and you'll still help control thrust. So it's worthwhile. This is the most inexpensive way to do it. It's minimally invasive. You can have it wired directly to the trans brake solenoid, so when the brake's on, it's on. You can control it separately if you want. My own personal installation, I believe the time to install all this stuff is now. I'm going to have it so I can turn it off and on. I'll try it both ways. I have two small turbos, so getting them to spool should not be a problem. But the choice is yours, and let's go over the parts it takes to do the simple installation. If you want to go with the more difficult ones, you probably should buy a kit with well-written instructions. They're definitely out there. Most of the top transmission aftermarket parts manufacturers have got you covered. If you want to gather parts and do your own setup, which I did, most race cars are performance street cars have already got rid of the metal lines and have gone to a -6 fitting. These are available straight thread. They go in all the way by hand. And then you just tighten them up against a washer or an O-ring. They're not pipe thread, they're straight thread. So this is just a -6 run tee, I believe it's called, or whatever the correct terminology is. It's female here and male. So my regular cooler flow will be just like it was, only missing 1.5 inches or so of fitting. And this is all just line I had laying around. And for right now, I have the 12-volt solenoid hard mounted. I believe this will clear my floorboard. Before I pull the transmission out of the Nova, I checked. I may have to turn this down, we'll see, but I'd like to hard mount it to avoid having to have a bracket. If I do make a bracket, my transmission shield has aluminum straps that go down underneath the pan. Not only would it be a good spot to run the line inside it next to the pan, I could also use that aluminum bracket to mount it. Now the solenoid itself, this is like a $20 solenoid off of Amazon. I bought it and then read the fine print that came with it. One, it's US solenoid and it's not made in the US. That's typical, but the specs on it are about 70 PSI and 250 degrees. While that would probably work, I don't trust it. I want to get Hydroforce is the brand. Their solenoid is rated for 300 degrees temperature, which if my cooler outlet is 300 degrees, I'm probably going to see other problems. 2 to 250 could happen. 300 is way on the high end, so I don't think 300 degrees will be a problem. And their valve's rated for 3,000 PSI. It's actually made for hydraulics, where this is like an air, water, liquid solenoid. So do not buy the cheap Amazon solenoid unless you like to live dangerously. I don't think I would trust it in a racing application. It's going to open on you and dump all the time, leading to overheating because you're going to bypass your cooler all the time, and we don't want to do that. In the last 2 TH400 builds, you saw me, I tapped the other ICT billet governor cover plates, which this is $10 or $12. I tapped it 1/8 inch up here, and I said later on I'd tap this 1/4 inch. This one I just tapped 1/4 inch on the bottom. And as a tuning tool, if I wanted to, if I did the 1/8 inch fitting up here, maybe a 90, the orifice is a lot smaller than the 1/4 inch pipe. So that would, if I wanted to get less gain, I could tune it with even the fitting. But in this case, my gains are going to be minimal due to this being an external dump. So I'm just going to go ahead and plumb it 1/4 inch. I could also make some jet arrangement if I wanted to play with that, but my goal in the simplest dump valve possible, I just want to get all the gain I can when I power it up. And whatever that is, I'll be happy with. The lines themselves, this is just traditional AN braided line and fittings. I have a pressure test kit, so I can actually assemble them and pressure them up and put them underwater, make sure they don't leak. When I race to Top Sportsman, you're in charge of checking your own lines and tagging them. It's a self-policing situation, but your lines, all your pressure lines had to be pressurized, checked, and tagged. I have bought some PTFE line, which has a Teflon liner, which they claim is better in a higher heat situation or higher pressure. It's supposed to be a better line. I've never used it before. I've always wrapped this with duct tape and cut it with a chop saw and assembled the fittings and washed out the black stuff that's created when you cut it with a chop saw, because you don't want that stuff in your hydraulic system or in your transmission, which is nothing but a hydraulic system. With the PTFE, I've had to order an actual cutter. It looks like a cable cutter, but it's made for line. It's not here yet. And I'll experiment with those, and I'll probably, when I plumb this for real, put the PTFE on it. But I don't believe there's anything wrong with traditional AN fittings. I've used them forever. But why not go with the latest and greatest? That when you go to actually buy the stuff, you just pick which one you want. I don't believe the cost difference is great. So more choices. And while speaking of choices, you don't have to go to the governor cover to dump the oil. You could drill and tap the pan as well in the sump. But then every time you remove the pan, you have to mess with everything, where this would be pretty permanent because there's nothing under here you need to get to. So that's why I chose the governor cover. I was going to buy a 1/4-inch weld bung and weld one on a stock governor cover just for kicks, because that would work just as well. In fact, I install them backwards so it's indented, so this will actually sit in closer. So I may still do that, because while this looks nice, you don't necessarily have to be this fancy, but by the time I buy a 1/4-inch weld bung, I could probably buy this piece. So, and this is handy, I can just directly tap it. So 1/4-inch takes a 7/16 drill and a 1/4-inch pipe tap. So that's dump valves in a nutshell. There's so much more than I even mentioned. Really fast cars have multi-stage dumps combined with a lockup torque converter, all done in 3-second eighth mile. There's a whole lot of clicking going on there. Me, I'm just kind of playing around, so learn as I go, and we'll see what the results are. Like, share, subscribe. If you happen to like this, check out my playlist. I haven't tallied up my videos, but I got to be getting close to about 200 videos. And a lot of them are on the Turbo 400. A lot of them are about other random shop stuff. So if you happen to get this far in the video and you're new, join the ride. Costs nothing to click the old subscribe button and join me at least twice a week. That's what it's become. I do my best to give you the best. So, have a great evening. Talk to you soon.